First up, though, this hour, it is the penultimate day of hearings in the Vijay Mallya extradition case in London. The absconding Indian businessman is in the Westminster Court, where the hearing is underway. The 61-year-old is facing charges of money laundering and fraud in India. Vijay Mallya has argued that there is political manipulation of anti-corruption agencies in India. How has the case progressed so far, and is the CBI likely to win its case? To explain all of this, we are now joined by an extradition law expert, Karishma Vora, who's been attending court and watching the proceedings as the trial unfolds. Karishma, thanks for joining us here. Well, first up, do you think the Indian government has really put up a best foot forward with regards to the Mallya hearing?
Thanks for having me. I think they've done a good job so far. I think their advocates and the Silk representing them in court is excellent. He has a very good reputation. There are a couple of things that I noticed, such as there were no solicitors on behalf of the Indian government in court. There were only barristers, and maybe that was just an aberration and perhaps their inability to attend yesterday morning. But that's just something that I observed. And another is that India doesn't have as many expert witnesses. So, for example, they would have benefited from someone who is an Indian law expert to counter the Indian law expert that has been put forward by Mr. Mallya, who actually is not an Indian lawyer at all. He's a barrister associated with a fellow set of chambers in London, actually, but could have easily been countered by somebody who is genuinely an Indian law expert practicing in India, and perhaps someone who is practicing in both countries as well.
Karishma, the defense is also saying that there is media bias involved, possibly bias with the judgment, as well as the Indian justice system preventing a fair trial for Mallya. What are your thoughts on that?
These are fairly strong statements to make, and the experts have tried to put this in while saying on an umbrella or overarching level that they do not disrespect the Indian courts, and they are not alleging corruption in the Indian courts, but they have put in so the expert himself has relied upon academic reports, and some academic reports suggest that there is an unfairness in the criminal justice system in India. The expert yesterday also suggested that Indian Supreme Court judges who are nearing retirement are likely to hold in favor of the government because they are vying lucrative government positions such as the head of the Human Rights Commission following their retirement. I think this is a very, very strong statement to make. It needs to be backed up. This could have been countered if, for example, India had an Indian law expert that would immediately have passed on a note to the Silk, who is representing India at the trial, and saying, there are so many judgments in the recent past. Take the privacy judgment, for example, which came out about 3 months ago, where the Supreme Court did not hold in favor of the government's arguments. And there are many other such cases as well. So, of course, Mr. Mallya has to prove the human rights angle, and one of the arguments that he can make is that he is likely to face an unfair trial when he goes back to India. If he is successful in establishing this, then he will not be extradited, and so he is, of course, doing his best to prove that point, and he has relied on experts. On the other hand, we have not, as in India has not relied on experts, which is something that could have been done. It might be India's thinking that these experts were not necessary, because if one demolishes the credibility of Mr. Mallya's expert witnesses, then India doesn't need to put forward its experts at all. But I would have erred on the side of caution given the amount that is hanging on this case. And I would have put in experts on behalf of Indian banking law as well as the Indian legal system.
All right, Karishma, stand by. We'll come to you in a second. Let's also go to our London Bureau Chief, Mandy Clark, joining us this hour. Mandy, you've been covering the Mallya trial for ever since it's been going on, and I understand that there is an update as well with the case as it pertains to some of the defense witnesses saying that the CBI is a cage parrot. What are you picking up from your sources at this point?
that is a direct quote from what we're hearing. This is now a political expert who said that, unfortunately, it has to parrot the words of its masters, and that's who's in political power at the time. Just to go back to what you were talking about earlier, I was in court when that professor was speaking yesterday, and he did make it clear that he didn't believe the Supreme Court was corrupt. He emphasized that it could be influenced by politics. Now, the defense did do a cross-examination, but we haven't seen a very strong cross-examination from the defense, and that's why the headlines and have been dominantly the defense, because we're not seeing that robust takedown of the experts on that the defense has brought in to courts. And the prosecution was well aware of the evidence months beforehand, because they had to provide all those expert witnesses before the court. So none of this evidence would have been new information to the prosecution. They did have time to prepare for it. It is a surprise that they didn't bring their own experts. But we are hearing now from a political expert who's implying essentially that the CBI is these anti-corruption agencies in India can be politically manipulated, and that's how the defense is setting out their strategy for Mallya.
Mandy, let's also talk about the coverage this is getting there in the UK. Certainly a lot of coverage here in India. What type of media coverage is this getting? There's also been stipulation by the defense saying that there is a lot of media bias. Shed some light on that angle.
We're hearing from both sides that there's media bias. We're hearing from the prosecution side that many reporters based in London are taking the defense side, and we're hearing from the defense that many Indian outlets are taking the prosecution side. So it feels like journalists are in a no-win situation. But I guess if you upset both sides, then you're probably doing a good job. Essentially, both sides are claiming there's media bias for the either side. It is part of the defense strategy, saying that he won't get a fair trial. He is a well-known public figure who is splashed over all the channels and newspapers, so it would be difficult for him to get a fair trial, and that the outlets are biased not to Mallya's favor.
All right, let's go back to Karishma. Mandy, we'll have you stand by there as well in London. Karishma, what could the Indian government perhaps have done better? Could the government have gotten its own experts? In your opinion, could things have planned out differently? I mean, there seems to be a lot of back and forth with the Supreme Court and the center here sort of pointing fingers.
Yes, I think so as I've mentioned previously, I think India could have got its own witnesses, expert witnesses, to counter the expert witnesses that have been put forward by Mr. Mallya. As Mandy said, all of these expert witness reports that have been relied upon by Mr. Mallya would have been available to the Indian side well in advance of this trial, which began last week. And there could have been a robust challenge to these statements that have been put in the expert witness statements and which came out orally from the expert evidence yesterday. I think another angle that India can or should think about exploring is that Mr. Mallya's passport has been revoked quite a long time ago. That means he's on his ILR visa. The ILR is the indefinite leave to remain visa, which is a visa without an expiry date that he has from the United Kingdom. But perhaps it's worth making inquiries about whether this visa holds if the underlying passport has been revoked. And if it doesn't, then it might just be a simple case of having him deported from the UK rather than having to go through this entire extradition process. So that's another angle that they should try and pursue with the immigration and the Home Office in the United Kingdom. And I think to continue in response to your question, what else could the Indian government have done? I think they really needed somebody who was well-versed with both sides, with the English and Indian sides in court, because there was such a lot of evidence or cross-examination and lines of cross-examination that could have been probed when Mr. Mallya's experts were being cross-examined, but which didn't, because I wouldn't expect an English barrister who doesn't know Indian law at all to just be able to come up with the kind of cross-examination and the factual basis for this cross-examination that he could have had he been supported by an Indian lawyer on the subject.
Absolutely. All right, Karishma, we'll come back to you in real quickly. Let me go to Mandy. Closing comments, Mandy, in terms of what we can expect is certainly lots happening there in terms of the trial, lots of back and forth in terms of responsibility, what perhaps went wrong, the court's orders not being taken seriously. What can we expect in the hours and days to come?
So we're going to see the cross-examination of this political expert. That should be quite interesting because hopefully the defense will have a bit of more robust cross-examination to see if the accusations that the CBI is essentially can be politically manipulated stands up. Also, we will have another expert witness, Paul Rex, who was going to be cross-examined again. He's going to be talking about financial. He's the financial expert. And then on Thursday, we're expecting an end to this case, a wrap-up of one final expert witness, and then closing summations. And we're not expecting a verdict until January.
All right, Mandy, getting us the very latest. And quick closing comments there from Karishma as well. What can we expect, Karishma, in the days and hours to come? Certainly a lot going on there in London.
I've always said, I've said from many months ago that it's going to be very difficult for India to have Mr. Mallya extradited because of the criminal angle that is necessary. So Article 2 of the India-UK extradition treaty requires that any person who is extradited be punishable with a minimum term of 1 year. Now, given that these are arguably civil offences of loan defaults and not criminal offences, so for example, it's certainly not a murder or a rape or any such heinous crime, establishing a punishable offence in these circumstances for a minimum term of 1 year is difficult. So, so let's see what the verdict has to say.
All right, Karishma Bora, getting us the very latest there in terms of the Mallya case. Thanks for those updates, Karishma and Mandy.